All right. So, yeah, as Megan said, I'm a human-centered designer in Deathcare. And when I go to parties and people ask me what that means, what I say is that think of the last time you were in the emergency room. Think of the beeping, think of the fluorescent lighting above you, think of the smells, anything that was on the wall. And the reason I say that is because I think that really accurately conjures up the feeling of what it's like to be in a space that wasn't necessarily designed for you. And what do I mean by that? When people ask me, like, well, what can human-centered design? Everything is created for humans, right? So, like, what can possibly not be human-centered? Well, human-centered design is all about bringing the patients, in the case of the ER, or the end user, into the design process from the very beginning. So often those ERs are not created with those patients' involvement, let alone the doctors or nurses who are staffing that unit. So the whole idea is that you want to make sure that you are co-creating all of the products and systems and structures that we are designing every day in our society with the end users. And so part of how we do that is through the mechanisms you would expect, right? Like interviewing, surveying people, but also things like handing them some Play-Doh and saying, okay, show me the thing you want me to create for you, right? Literally storyboard out what you would like your ideal emergency room experience to look like, or your ideal funeral home experience to look like. And you can be applying this to literally any of these end-of-life death care scenarios as well. So the reason why we do this is because as designers, we can get a little in our heads as far as assuming that we know exactly what people want and what people need. And that leads us to make assumptions. And those assumptions are not always correct, whether it's because we're failing to take into account someone's disability or the language they speak, or it's just simply because what's intuitive to you might not necessarily be intuitive to me. And so this idea came out of the tech world, right? These are all companies that use human-centered design, because when you're making an app that's designed to be used by millions and millions of people, having incorrect assumptions can cost you a lot of money, right? And so in tech, they often say, like, you have to fail fast and iterate, because you literally can't replace just getting your app into the hands of users and actually testing, right? Now, I don't know how many of you work in death care, but this isn't actually the approach that many, funeral homes or cemeteries necessarily take. So how do we then take this approach of bringing the users into the design process and apply that to the death care space? So that's what I do. So since we're being sponsored by a wealth management company, let's start off by talking about affordability. So this is something that people often talk to me about when I bring up that I work in death care with hospices and funeral homes. And so what they say is like, look, funerals are super expensive. And it's true. The average funeral in America costs around $10,000 to $12,000, right? And we also know that the average American cannot necessarily afford even a $400 emergency expense, right? So there's a gap to be closed there. So one of the groups that I work with is called the Funeral Consumers Alliance, and that's a nonprofit that basically advocates for consumers, i.e. funeral consumers, i.e. all of us. And what they do is for the last 20 years, they have been working with the FTC to sort of pressure them to try to update what's known as the funeral rule, which is the one main legislation that governs funeral homes in the United States. And so finally, in November of 2022, they actually did issue what's called an ANPR, an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, where they asked the public about 40 questions around how they would like the funeral rule to be revised. And so one of the main questions they were asking about is whether or not they should require funeral homes to post their prices online, because that's something funeral consumers report is a big issue for them, right? And so this was actually a very human-centered process of going out and asking people what they wanted. And this is actually a piece of legislation that's been legalized in other countries across the world. So the UK, Australia, the UK actually put this into effect in September of 2021. And what you find is that when you include these price transparency laws, that it does indeed lead to greater affordability for clients, because then they have the ability to shop around. This is a chart showing SCI, which is the main funeral conglomerate in the United States. their prices dropped by 30%. And so you would think that this would actually put funeral homes and consumers directly at odds with each other, right? Because, it's a zero-sum game. Money that's going into one person's pocket is coming out of another person's pocket. But what they found is that the CMA, which is the UK's version of the FTC, did a study after they implemented this piece of legislation, and they asked funeral directors, hey, what was the effect that this regulation had on the industry? And an overwhelming majority of funeral directors said that they were either very supportive, 68% that they were very supportive of this legislation going into effect, 21% said that they were quite supportive. And so one of the big takeaways for me here is that this actually produced a better result for everybody, right? It produced a better result for the end user when you listen to what the end users want, and it also produces a better result for the funeral directors themselves, because it feels good to be transparent with people and then have your customers really trust you and know that you have their best interests at heart. So this leads into the next big principle in human-centered design, which is this principle of inclusive design. So if you were a tech company and you are making a app for millions of people, you have to figure out who you're going to test that app with, right? And you might think that the best people to test with are people who most closely resemble your average user, right? Wrong. That's actually, what they find is that the people that you ought to be testing with in order to produce the best results are by finding your most vulnerable populations and testing with them first. So let me give you an example of an un-Deathcare related company called OXO. You might be familiar with OXO. They create kitchen implements, right? And so they have these rubber bottom bowls that are hard to slip around. They have these big chunky bicycle handle peelers. And OXO basically tests all of their products first with people with arthritis and mobility conditions. And what they find is that when you actually test with your most vulnerable populations first, that actually produces a better result for everybody, for your entire audience, right? So this is just a concept that they created of a syringe, for example. And they were creating this syringe for patients who might not have any medical training to be able to self-administer. And what you find is that this actually then produces a better syringe for people who do have hospital training. Like if you were a nurse during the AIDS crisis who was deathly afraid of getting stuck with a needle that had been used by an AIDS patient, how awesome would it have been to be able to use a syringe that was created by OXO, right? So this is just to show that designing for the most vulnerable in the population can actually produce better results as opposed to your average user, let alone the fact that trying to determine who your average user is often often creates a lot of, you get mired in racism, sexism, homophobia, et cetera, all down the line. And so I think that this principle is really best illustrated by this cartoon called Shovel the Ramp, where you have these kids who are waiting to get into school on a snowy day, and you have this dude who's shoveling the ramp to let them in. And so there's this kid in a wheelchair who says, hey, can you shovel the ramp? And he says, well, I'm gonna shovel the steps first so I can get all these other kids in, and then I'll shovel the ramp for you, right? And then the kid in the wheelchair says, but actually if you shovel the ramp, everyone can use the ramp. This is actually a better solution for everybody, right? And so how can we take these inclusive design principles and apply that to death care? So, first we can definitely design websites that are easy to navigate and allow people to get adequate access to pricing information. We can also think about things like bereavement and how much bereavement we allow people in this country. So this would particularly benefit people who are families or community members of people who die by suicide, drug overdose, any kind of traumatic death, are people who would particularly benefit from mandated bereavement leave. In Europe, most European countries require at least 2 days of bereavement by law. In America, we require 0, right? And so there's so many of these types of policies that we can use to benefit the most vulnerable that will actually benefit everyone in our society. Another example is I give a workshop on how we can design death care for trans people. And so often an issue that they will bring up in those workshops is this fear of being dead named or being referred to by the name that maybe their parents gave them at birth that they no longer use. And so instead of using their dead name, using their preferred name on their gravestone or in their obituary, right? And so the actual practical result of this just means doing more pre-planning and not assuming that you necessarily know what those people want without asking them, right? And so when you actually ask people what they want, we see lots and lots of gaps in death care between what they want and what they get. 7 in 10 Americans want to die at home, but only 3 in 10 manage to do that. There's a lot to unpack there, but one of the reasons why is because we fail to have these conversations. Likewise, 92% of Americans know and say they understand the importance of having end-of-life conversations, but only 32% manage to have those conversations. There's a 60% gap between people who know it's important, say they want to do it, and the people who actually end up doing it. So part of what I do, and this is, the process I went through with Megan, is I help people create their end-of-life plans and initiate some of these conversations. And sometimes people say, oh my gosh, that must be such a morbid thing to do. And what I say is actually, it's a really beautiful thing to do, because if you're planning your funeral, you're literally planning a party with all your friends and all of your favorite people, all your favorite food, all your favorite music, right? And so I think that we fail to underscore the importance of beauty in this end-of-life planning process. And I think if we did that a little bit more, people would be more open to having the conversation. There's a lot of statistics on here, but I wanted to highlight the fact that there's so much data. We have this misconception that beauty and function are at odds with each other, when in fact, for example, when you give music therapy to dementia patients, that lessens the need for medication in 67% of those patients. Art in hospitals and hospices literally lessens the need for pain medication, lessens the length of hospital stays, right? And so this actually saves money for our society, right? And it's not just about the beauty as an end in of itself, even though we should value that as well. So one of the things that I do is I'm the president of the National Home Funeral Alliance, which is a nonprofit that teaches people how to care for their own dead at home, which is legal in all 50 states. And this is something that people choose both for affordability reasons, but also because they want to be able to curate this beautiful experience for themselves. So just as a trigger warning, there's photos of people who've died on the next slide. But I wanted to share with you some of the photos that our members send to us, just to give you a sense of what it looks like when people choose to do funerals at home. And so this is something that I think if we were able to actually have this conversation ahead of time, and this is the kind of thing that you can really only do if you're having those conversations, right? But that is something that will absolutely allow people to have more freedom of choice to choose what they truly want and involve their families and give them more of that control. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about what I think is a major blocker to people having these end-of-life conversations, which is this fear of suffering at end of life. For our pets, who are arguably some of the most vulnerable members of our society because they cannot speak and they cannot verbally consent to things, when they are suffering at end of life, we often make the decision that the most humane thing to do is to give them medication to hasten their death. This is a privilege that we afford to animals in all 50 states in the United States, but a privilege we only afford to humans in 10 of them. Now this year, there are 18 states that are considering bills that would legalize medical aid in dying, including Pennsylvania. It's actually already legal in New Jersey. But basically what medical aid in dying is, if you haven't heard of it before, is when you take somebody who is mentally capable and terminally ill with a diagnosis within 6 months and allow a doctor to prescribe them a medication that will hasten their death in the event of unbearable suffering. And I will note that many people who choose this option do not necessarily wind up taking the medication. Some people really just want to be able to have it on hand to lessen the anxiety that they will be having to go through needless suffering at end of life. And this is something that is supported by 74% of Americans, but is available legally to only 20% of Americans today. So lastly, I'm going to conclude by saying that with all of these factors in mind, affordability, accessibility, beauty, and freedom from as much suffering as possible, I want to tell you a little bit about how my end-of-life journey would look. So I'm predisposed to genetically predisposed to ovarian cancer, Alzheimer's, and diabetes. And obviously those have different levels of suffering, but if that were a diagnosis that I were to receive, I would want to have in-home palliative care and hospice care in my room, surrounded by the art that I've curated over my life and surrounded by the family members and friends that I've chosen to share my life with. And in the bedside table, I would have my advance directive that would lay out all of my end-of-life wishes as well as my funeral plan. And that funeral plan would include the names of all the people who've chosen to and agreed to wash and shroud my body after I die. And then after that happens, I would go to be buried in a green burial ground. So this is what I would choose for myself, and all of the work that I'm doing, either on the government level, with businesses, with nonprofits, and with individuals, is geared towards creating that human-centered death. And so I would encourage all of you to think about what that looks like in your case. And so with that, I'm going to leave you with this image from this nonprofit that I work with called A Sacred Passing, which is based in Seattle, Washington, a state where medical aid and dying is legal. And they run this program called A Place to Die. And A Place to Die is where volunteers, everyday people, will open up a room in their home to allow someone who may not have a house or who may not have a safe place to die to come and take their medical aid and dying medication. And this is something that is enabled by the fact that all of those systems have been put in place to allow those people to have this human-centered, beautiful death. So I would encourage us all to think about not only what constitutes a good death for you, but also what would it look like if we designed our death care systems, our hospitals, our funeral homes, our cemeteries, our crematories, with our most vulnerable populations in mind. Thank you.